Johann Beethoven, tenor singer for the German court at Bonn, earned very little salary and could only afford attic rooms to shelter his family. But he was certain that his son, born in this tiny attic room on December 16th, 1770, would help him to a better way of life.
If Mozart trained his son Wolfgang to be a child protege, I can train mine too.
The baby was christened Ludwig, in honor of his grandfather, the music director for the court. When Ludwig was 6, the family moved to an attic apartment in the Fischer house in Bonn. 2 brothers, Karl and Johann, were born here. Mrs. Fischer, their landlady, later recalled,
I can still see Ludwig as a tiny boy standing on a little footstool in front of the piano to which his stern and severe father had condemned him.
It was only natural that a lad who was the son and grandson of professional musicians should be made to study music. The boy's first public appearance as a pianist was in Cologne, 15 miles down the Rhine River from Bonn. His father published an announcement about the 7-year-old Ludwig's concert.
Today, the court tenor Beethoven will have the honor to display his little son, who will play several piano concertos.
Ludwig received little education in addition to his musical studies. He was enrolled for only a short time at the grammar school in Bonn, where he studied Latin and French. Long walks along the riverbank provided the youth with his only relief from long hours of practice.
Ludwig did not care much for companions or society. His happiest hours were those when he was free of all company. He loved the Rhine.
Ludwig developed a fondness for the pipe organ. He arranged to play for the 6 o'clock morning mass in exchange for lessons from the regular organist. This unpaid service also gave the 10-year-old boy a chance to practice on the instrument. The palace in Bonn was a handsome building in which Ludwig's father and grandfather served as court musicians. In 1779, the monarch hired a brilliant young musician by the name of Christian Neefe to serve as organist and to develop an opera orchestra. Neefe became Ludwig's music teacher. After Ludwig had studied with him for a year, Neefe remarked,
He is a boy of 12 with a most promising talent. He plays the piano skillfully and with power. He is also a good sight reader. I am now training him in composition and have paid to have some of his music published.
By the time Beethoven was 14, he was giving music lessons. 2 of his pupils were the children of the widow von Breuning. The von Breunings were a noble family that lived in a handsome house. It was through this cultured family that Ludwig first became acquainted with great literature. The earliest known portrait of Beethoven was a silhouette made when he was 16. At this time, he was serving as assistant court organist and pianist. What social life he knew, he enjoyed in the von Breuning home, where, in spite of the class consciousness of the times, he was regarded as a member of the family. At 17, Beethoven made a trip to Vienna. How the trip was financed, for Vienna is a long way from Bonn, no one knows. He spent less than 2 weeks in the city, but during these few days, he found time to meet Mozart. A friend described the boy's visit to the Mozart home.
Beethoven asked Mozart to give him a melody on which he could improvise. He always played well when he was excited, and now he was inspired. Mozart was so impressed that he said everyone should keep his eyes on the lad, for someday he would give the world something to talk about.
On his return to Bonn, Beethoven stopped in the quaint old city of Augsburg. From this point on, it was a hurried journey.
The nearer I came to Bonn, the more frequent were the letters from my father urging me to travel as fast as possible, as my mother was fatally ill.
Beethoven arrived in Bonn in time to see his mother, but within a few days, she passed away. His despondent father started spending more and more time in the local taverns. He eventually lost his voice and in turn his job as tenor. Ludwig was then appointed the official head of the family by the court. A few miles south of Bonn was the cloister of Marienforst. Concerning this, a professor told an interesting story.
I met Beethoven one day after dinner and told him that the church at Marienforst had been repaired and the organ restored and greatly improved. I begged him to play it. What was amazing after we got there and Beethoven started playing was that the laboring people, the peasants who lived around the cloister, were so greatly impressed that they put down their tools and listened with amazement and obvious pleasure.
Beethoven celebrated his 21st birthday with a pleasant trip up the Rhine River with members of the court orchestra. They were going to Mergentheim, a town about 250 miles from Bonn, where they were to play for the Congress of the Teutonic Order. At the castle of the Teutonic Order, Beethoven gave a piano recital. A music critic wrote,
I have heard one of the greatest pianists here, Beethoven. The greatness of this likable, light-hearted man may be guessed from his almost endless wealth of ideas.
Beethoven returned to Bonn a success. A portrait of Joseph Haydn of Vienna was painted during his visit to London. En route, he passed through Bonn and met Beethoven. After listening to a cantata by the young composer, Haydn encouraged him to continue serious music study in Vienna. Following Haydn's advice, Beethoven journeyed to Vienna, the music capital of Europe. Now nearing 22, he wished to pursue his career as a pianist and to study composition. He went to Haydn's home to take lessons in composition. Unfortunately, the aging master was so busy with his own compositions that he had little time to correct the exercises Beethoven did for him. Soon, the younger composer was studying with second-rate composers who were able to give him more time. Haydn's patron, Prince Nicholas Esterhazy, invited the young Beethoven to visit his castle at Eisenstadt. While at the palace, Beethoven composed some settings of the Mass, which greatly pleased the prince when they were performed in his chapel. Beethoven returned to Vienna for his first public appearance. It took place at the Burg Theater. During these youthful days, the audiences came to know him as an outstanding piano soloist. It was to be many years before he was recognized as a composer. Some of his earliest works were minuets and German dances, written for performance in the magnificent ballroom of the palace in Vienna. At a concert given in this salon in 1795, Beethoven played one of his own piano concertos on the same program with Haydn. Beethoven now undertook a concert tour as a pianist.
I write from Prague. I am getting on very well. I shall earn considerable money. I shall remain here a few weeks and then move on to Dresden and Leipzig.
On the tour, the court of Frederick the Great in Berlin was his most northern appearance. King Frederick, who was an enthusiastic cellist, requested that Beethoven appear several times, marveling at the young man's keyboard ability. Beethoven was now 30. Although Vienna still knew him principally as a fine pianist, it was in this, his 30th year, that he composed his Pathetique Sonata for piano and heard his Symphony No. 1 performed for the first time. Beethoven loved the magnificent Vienna woods. Almost every summer he moved away from the noise and the frantic social world of Vienna to some secluded retreat.
How happy I am when I am able to wander through the bushes and shrubs, under trees and over rocks. No one can love the country as I do.
Wherever Beethoven went, he took a sketchbook with him, perhaps nothing more than a folded sheet or two of music paper. On these, he would jot down musical ideas as they occurred to him.
One composition is scarcely finished when another is begun. Often I compose 3, even 4 pieces at the same time.
Many of Beethoven's early quartets and other chamber music were first performed at Prince Schwarzenberg's palace in Vienna.
I don't write in the form that I choose, but in forms that people will buy. But I don't write only for money.
The gardens of Schönbrunn Palace near Vienna were but a 10-minute walk away from Beethoven's summer lodging of 1801. The composer spent many hours resting in the shade of the trees, for he was not well. On these walks through the garden, he mused,
I know that my noblest faculty, my hearing, has become very bad. There is a question as to whether or not a cure is possible. My ears sing and buzz continually, day and night. For 2 years, I have avoided all social gatherings because I couldn't bring myself to tell people I was deaf.
Crude ear trumpets that would fit across the head were made for Beethoven, each one a little larger, but none of them effective.
In the concert hall, I must get very close to the orchestra. Often I can hear someone speaking softly, but I cannot understand the words. If anyone shouts, it is unbearable for me.
On orders from his doctor, and in order to spare his hearing, Beethoven retreated to a little house in Heiligenstadt for the summer. From the windows, he could see the Danube River, and everything the composer could desire, except his hearing, was here. Fresh air, sun, green fields, delightful walks, solitude. Unfortunately, the loneliness of this place gave Beethoven time to brood over his melody. So much so that in a will written here, the most tragic words ever uttered by a composer were penned.
For 6 years, I have been hopelessly afflicted, finally forced to face the fact that I will be deaf forever. I have been compelled to withdraw from society, to live alone, for it is impossible for me to say to people, speak louder, shout, for I am deaf. How humiliated I was when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance, and I heard nothing. Such despair. A little more and I would have ended my own life. It was only art that held me back. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I brought forth all that was in me. The 6th of October, 1803. Ludwig van Beethoven.
Beethoven, at 34, was a man of simple tastes, if irregular habits. Now that his hearing was impaired, he could no longer dance or visit with friends of taste and refinement. His lonely hours were spent reading books and composing music. At Heiligenstadt, Beethoven completed his Second Symphony. It was scheduled for performance in a gargantuan concert, which also included his First Symphony, his oratorio Christ on the Mount of Olives, and his C minor piano concerto. The concert was to take place at the Theater an der Wien. Rehearsals started at 8 in the morning. By 2:30 in the afternoon, everybody was tired and hungry. Beethoven's friend, Prince Lichnowsky, saved the day. He sent for large baskets of bread and butter, cold meats and drinks, and everyone helped themselves. With good dispositions restored, the rehearsal continued on to sundown. Beethoven moved to inexpensive lodgings on the top floor of an apartment building located midway between Vienna and Heiligenstadt. It was probably to these rooms that Count Bernadotte, an envoy from the court in Paris, came to suggest to Beethoven that he compose a work to honor Napoleon. Beethoven was fascinated by the French Revolution and its pledge of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. Although he was the son of a musician's servant, Beethoven had never been able, in this class-conscious period, to accept the fact that he was not the equal of any man. Once in a fit of anger, he said to Lichnowsky,
Prince, what you are by accident of birth. What I am through my own efforts.
Beethoven started writing his Third Symphony, which was to honor Napoleon. A friend wrote,
In this symphony, he had in mind Napoleon when he was a friend and leader of the people. I was the first to bring him the news that Napoleon had proclaimed himself emperor. Beethoven flew into a rage. He took his pen and scratched out the name of Napoleon on the title page and retitled it Sinfonia Eroica, saying,
Is Napoleon then nothing more than an ordinary human being? Now he too will trample on all the rights of man to please his ambitions.
The Third Symphony was first performed at the palace of Prince Lobkowitz. Ironically, the symphony, which had been inspired by Napoleon, champion of liberty, was given its premiere just a few short weeks before Napoleon, the conquering tyrant, captured Vienna. It was also ironic that the symphony, which was meant to champion the common man, should have its initial performance in the palatial halls of titled nobility. The form of the music itself proved to be too new, too revolutionary. The music critics called it grotesque, bizarre, and claimed that it lacked unity. Once again, the restless Beethoven changed his residence in Vienna, this time renting rooms in Baron Pascalatti's building. He moved into an apartment on the top floor because, with more stairs to climb, the rent was cheaper. Although he moved from place to place on the average of twice a year, Beethoven kept returning to Pascalatti's because he liked the view from his room of the Danube and the beautiful hills surrounding Vienna. Here also, he was but a few doors away from the home of his good friend, Prince Lichnowsky. The personal characteristics of the composer were described by a friend shortly after an engraving of Beethoven was published.
In his behavior, he was awkward and helpless. He seldom took anything into his hands without dropping and breaking it. He frequently knocked his inkwell into the piano. It is hard to understand how he was ever able to shave himself.
Beethoven never lost his fondness for taking long walks through the wooded countryside around Vienna. Entries in the notebook that was always with him on his walks began including melodic ideas for an opera which he was going to call Leonora, or Conjugal Love. It was to epitomize the composer's ideal of the perfect and faithful wife. In the opera, which was finally titled Fidelio, or Fidelity, Leonora's husband is condemned to death as a political prisoner. In her devotion, Leonora masquerades as a prison guard in black uniform to try and effect her husband's release.
My Fidelio was not understood by the public, but I know that someday they will appreciate it. I am well aware of its value. However, I know the symphony is my real element.
Discouraged at the reception his only opera received, Beethoven returned to the Heiligenstadt district to take up quarters, sharing a lodging with the writer Grillparzer. Here he completed his famous Fifth Symphony in C minor. During his leisurely strolls through the Vienna woods, Beethoven sketched the Pastoral Symphony, his sixth.
You ask me where I get my ideas for a symphony. They come, unsummoned, out in the open air, in the woods, while I am walking in the silence of the night or early morning. They roar and storm about me until I have set them down in notes. I change many things, discard, and try again until I am satisfied. I live only in my compositions.
Count Rasimovsky, the Russian ambassador to Austria, lived in an elegant palace in Vienna. He commissioned Beethoven to compose some string quartets, which, when completed, were first performed before titled nobility in his grand ballroom. The works have since been known as Beethoven's Rasimovsky quartets. Beethoven, now 45, was almost completely deaf, but new works continued to flow from his pen. Incidental music for Goethe's play Egmont, the Emperor Concerto for piano and orchestra, and the Seventh Symphony. He also made changes in Fidelio, hoping for a more successful acceptance of his opera. He made a journey to Linz to visit his brother Johann, who was a successful druggist. Although Beethoven worked on his Eighth Symphony in Linz, it was said that he spent more time meddling in his brother's family affairs than he did in composing. Ludwig gladly returned to Vienna. Shortly after he moved into a home on the outskirts of the city, his recently completed Eighth Symphony was first performed in Vienna. It was not as well received as the composer had hoped, possibly due to the fact that it was performed on the program immediately after his longer and more powerful Seventh Symphony. Within the year, Beethoven moved to a home that afforded larger quarters. His brother Karl had died, leaving his son Karl Jr. under the legal guardianship of the composer. The boy was to be a burden and a trial for Beethoven for the rest of his life. No sooner had the nephew moved in than trouble erupted. He was full of mischief and always in difficulty. As if this were not enough, a lawsuit was brought against the composer on the grounds that his deafness made him unfit as a guardian. Karl failed school, once tried suicide, and finally left to join the army. The mature Beethoven now started to work on his longest and most revolutionary symphony, his Ninth. It was to include a choral finale based on Schiller's poem Ode to Joy, verses that had attracted Beethoven for years because of their expression of the brotherhood of all mankind. After 5 years of hard work, the symphony was given its first performance at the Kettner Tor Theater. The contralto soloist for the symphony later said,
At the close of the performance, something happened that brought tears to almost everyone's eyes. Beethoven, although standing in the middle of the orchestra, heard nothing, not even the applause. In the midst of this vast theater, he kept his back to the audience, still beating time until I got him to turn around and face the people who were still clapping. In this turning around, the audience realized that he had not done it before, because he could not hear. It acted on the public like a shock. A volcanic eruption of sympathy and admiration followed.
A portrait of Beethoven was painted in which he held the manuscript for his Missa Solemnis, his greatest choral masterpiece. When it was completed, a friend took the music to Russia for its first performance. He wrote back to the composer,
The effect on the public cannot be described. I don't exaggerate when I say that I have never heard anything so sublime.
Although Beethoven occasionally took a walk down the Danube, he was less active now. His health was failing, and the constant worry over his nephew troubled his mind. During these rambles, he jotted themes in his sketchbook for another opera, an oratorio, a requiem, and a 10th symphony. He decided to take a journey by coach to visit his remaining brother, the druggist, who now lived in Nixendorf. Johann had suggested that Beethoven's health was bound to improve under the care of his wife, who would cook good meals for him and tend to his every need. The Nixendorf home of Johann was cold and damp. True, Beethoven was provided with a room, but beyond that, his brother and his wife ignored the composer, caring little about the state of his health. The lonely Beethoven longed to return to Vienna. Finally, Johann arranged transportation for him in an open milk wagon. The cold ride in the open wagon gave Beethoven pneumonia. Back in his disorderly room in Vienna, he recovered from this illness, but both his liver ailment and his dropsy continued to grow worse.
It is my hope yet to bring several great works into the world, and then, like an aged child, to end my earthly days somewhere among kindly companions.
A young composer by the name of Franz Schubert came to visit the ailing master. Shy and retiring, Schubert had worshipped Beethoven as the greatest giant of music. The modest Schubert reluctantly played several of his songs for his host.
Truly a divine spark dwells in Schubert.
Beethoven, now 57, had been bedridden for weeks, growing continually weaker. A friend stopped to see him.
I visited the master in the afternoon of March 26th. At 5 o'clock there came a flash of lightning accompanied by a violent clap of thunder. After this startling display of nature, Beethoven opened his eyes, lifted his right hand, and looked up for several seconds with his fist closed. He let his raised hand sink to the bed. The genius of this great master of tones fled from this world.
All Vienna mourned. The Church of the Holy Trinity was completely filled for the funeral service. The choir sang Beethoven's Miserere. The organist played the funeral march from his Lichnowsky sonata. More than 10,000 Viennese lined the streets as the catafalque headed for the Währing Cemetery. 8 court music directors led the procession, followed by 36 torchbearers, of whom the faithful Schubert was one. At the cemetery, Beethoven's friend Grillparzer gave the eulogy.
What he was through his art alone. To his final day, he preserved a loving heart towards all mankind, a kindness for the whole world. Thus he lived, and thus he will remain for all time.
Thank you.